In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at the pelvis and the femur as we start to closely examine the nature, the biometrics, and the overall biomechanics associated with the thigh and the abdomen. As William Bass points out in his work, the hip bone or the innominates consist of three distinct portions that unite at about the 12th year of life. They are part of the appendicular skeletal system, but they are closely associated with the functionality of the lower extremities. For this lecture, we'll take a look at the pelvis as a whole. So we'll be talking about the pelvic girdle. So what is the pelvic girdle? Well, the hip or pelvic girdle consists of two coxal bones or hip bones. The pelvic girdle provides a strong and stable support for the lower extremities on which the real weight of the body is being carried. We know that a great deal of the weight of the body is associated with the axial skeletal structure, specifically the vertebral column, the body of each of the vertebrae, and then, of course, the pelvic girdle itself. The coxal bones are united to each other anteriorly at the symphysis, the pubic symphysis, or the symphysis pubis, and they unite posteriorly with the sacrum. And so we know that the sacral vertebrae, their design, and then their fusion are part of this unique phenomenon that is associated with the design of the human pelvic girdle. Together with the sacrum and the coccyx, the two coxal bones of the pelvic girdle form the baseline structure for the pelvis itself. Now, the pelvis is divided into a greater and lesser expression by an oblique plane that passes through the sacral promontory, that portion of the fully fused sacrum that is again most superior. So it creates the kind of anchor or foundation upon which the entire vertebral column sits. So that promontory is where we kind of recognize an oblique plane that then creates an upper and lower or greater and lesser expression to the pelvis. The greater expression represents the expanded portion, the brim of the pelvis, if you want to think about it that way, and then the lesser pelvis, which is sometimes referred to as the true pelvis, the interior in a sense. So it's inferior and posterior to the brim or the edge of the pelvis, and it will incorporate, the ilia, the sacrum, the coccyx, the pubis, and then it will also incorporate the pelvic inlet, and then the inferior opening of the pelvic outlet. So basically what's happening here is if you think of the pelvis as a bowl, you have the greater expression at the top, which is identified with that promontory. So if you identified where that promontory was and then moved conceptually around the top edge of the pelvis, that would be considered to be the kind of the upper pelvis. And then the lower pelvis, the lesser pelvis, the true pelvis, is everything below that, and that's what we're focusing on today for the most part, with the exception of some muscle attachments. The lesser pelvis then has that, if we're to rotate it and look through it from the superior to inferior kind of perspective, it has that inlet and outlet, which is what we look through when we are looking down through the body of the individual. That inlet and then the outlet on the base is very, very important because these are aspects of the unique overall architecture of the human pelvic girdle. One of the biometric and biomechanical situations that developed as we see bipedality being an important part of our overall design is that inlet and outlet measure. The overall space that is found in both males and females was greatly reduced between the traditional ape model and then the now human model that is important in anthropological circles for comparison and is also important with regard to the structural variation that exists between a traditional, let's say, knuckle walking quadruped and a traditional biped. And so that's something that is monitored throughout the fossil record to be able to identify when more proficient bipeds emerge. So the shape and size of the inlet outlet within that lesser or true pelvic region is extremely important for the work of anthropologists. In medical or clinical circles, the inlet outlet shape and size is very, very important. And pelvimetry is a particular kind of osteometric application that is associated with this area. It is the measurement, usually a manual measurement, of the size of the inlet and outlet associated with the birth canal. And again, the shapes and size of the birth canal and everything else associated with it and above it was something, again, important to the work and is something important to the work of anthropologists as they're looking at, in this case, the number of births and the requirement of assistance during birth and some of these things that are not seen in the ape model, but are seen in this case, the human model. So this pelvimetry, the measurement of the pelvic cavity in pregnant females, is important to physicians because the fetus must, in this case, pass through the narrower opening of that pelvis, the lesser pelvis, at the time of birth. And so this is something that is being assessed with regard to some of the risks associated with birth and whether or not there are additional kinds of uh, operative options for the mother as she's considering childbirth and what is going to occur at the end of the gestation period. Now, generally in osteometrics and in anatomy and in the work of bioarchaeology and, of course, biological anthropology, the hips themselves, these coxal bones, are divided into three components based upon their growth and development. So we have two of these hip bones. The superior portions of each are associated with the ilium, the large section, the largest section of that developed and developing pelvis, an inferior and anterior pubis, and then an inferior and posterior ischium. Eventually, again, these three bones are going to fuse into one, and the area of fusion is very, very deep. It's a lateral fossa that is called the acetabulum. So the acetabulum is that fossa, and it's also an important landmark for where these three bones unify. And so there are a variety of measurements that are associated with that interior location that are important to understanding something about the size and shape of the pelvic girdle. This helps in identifying sex and, of course, age as well. Although the adult coxa are both single bones, it is common to discuss them as, again, part of a unified girdle and then each consisting of three portions or areas. Let's take a look at these three areas and some of the important landmarks associated with each. And you can pause the lecture along the way and take a closer look at this image. I will be providing you with a lecture handout that will also be electronically associated with the link to this video lecture. The ilium, again, is the largest of the three subdivisions of the coxal bone. Its superior border, the iliac crest, ends anteriorly in the anterior superior iliac spine. So again, you can see the shape and size of that iliac crest, which is a very important attachment point for some of the muscle structures associated with the abdomen and, of course, the movement, some of the gross movements of the thigh. Posteriorly, the iliac crest ends in the posterior superior iliac spine. So we have these two spines, one on either side. The spines themselves serve as important attachment points, um, again, associated with abdominal muscles for the most part. Now, inferior to the superior iliac spine is the greater sciatic notch. This particular location becomes very, very important in terms of some of the forensics associated with the pelvis. A lot of the qualitative and quantitative natures associated with the pelvic girdle, its shape, its unique landmarks, these are all things that are important to sexing an individual. This uh, sciatic notch is also important in that assessment process. The internal surface of the ilium, again, you have to look at it kind of from the medial side, so it's as if you're standing inside of that pelvic girdle. This is the iliac fossa. And again, fossa is an important term because it's those larger expanses, those larger areas where we're seeing major muscle attachments. Its concave nature is associated with the iliacus muscle attachment. So the iliac fossa and the iliacus are two things you would like to associate in terms of a landmark and then a particular muscle structure. And this is important for flexing and then rotating the thigh in a medial fashion. So you're flexing it and then you're kind of rotating it. Um, the insertion is going to be the greater trochanter of the femur. So this is another one of these important muscles that connects the function of both of these areas of the body, and of course they're very much associated with the overall structure of both the proximal features of the femur or the femora and the overall architecture of that pelvic bowl, which again is something very unique when you compare the human model to some of the other um, pelvic models within the Primates order. In terms of your muscle handout or your muscle guide, the reference guide that I gave you, this would appear on page 4. So you can take a look at that and kind of compare the two, and then framing it in terms of the overall structure of these areas. Now, posterior to the iliac fossa then is the auricular surface, which articulates with the sacrum. The auricular surface is also a very important location for being able to recover some of the forensic data from, in this case, fragments of the pelvis, or if you have one or the other or both of the pelvic bones themselves. So this auricular surface, which articulates with or is the attachment for some of the ligaments that connect the sacrum to the pelvis, this is an important location. That iliosacral joint is expressed with this articular surface. The ischium is the inferior posterior portion of the coxal bone. It contains a prominent ischial spine, a lesser sciatic notch below the spine, and then an ischial tuberosity. The rest of the ischium, the ramus in this case, joins with the pubis, and together they form or they surround the obturator foramen. So again, important landmarks now associated with the ischium. So you have the ilium, you have the ischium, and now the last piece, the third piece, the pubis. The pubis is the anterior and inferior portion of the coxal bone. It consists of a superior ramus, an inferior ramus, and a body that contributes to the formation of that important connection point, that symphysis pubis, or the pubic symphysis. Remember that the symphysis, or symphyses rather, are joints. What we have seen up to this point in terms of a symphysis have been those intervertebral joints of the vertebral column, again an axial skeletal structural quality. And then this is the second time we've seen a symphysis, again broadly connecting large areas within the skeletal anatomy. And in terms of movement, it is slight, Generally, it will move again anterior to posterior just slightly as there's stress and strain on the pelvic girdle. But then also during things like childbirth, you can have a lateral stretch or movement to a symphysis like this. We've also seen developmentally a symphysis in the mandible, but of course in the human model that symphysis disappears. So this is a joint, but it is one that is more of a broad connection between skeletal elements than something that is important for a specific kind of movement or action. So take maybe a brief look at this image, maybe pause the lecture video to look at it a little more closely, and then start it up again. And then what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about where the pelvic girdle articulates with the lower extremities, specifically that hip joint or the ball and socket joint that we associate with the acetabulum. So again, as you already now know, there are three developmental parts and they unify or fuse in that acetabulum. Now the acetabulum of the pelvic girdle is important because it is where we find the hip joint, which is a ball and socket joint. Basically, you have the head of the femur fitting into this cup-like depression. The shoulder is another good example where we have the glenoid cavity and the head of the humerus. These locations, the orientation of the head as it's moving up into that ball and socket environment, the size and shape of the exterior of the ball and socket, and then ultimately the curvature and the overall architectural shape of the head of that conjoining or articulating bone. These all become important qualities for the anthropologist to look at when they're thinking about the functionality of the joint itself. But it, again, fits into that typical kind of ball and socket expression. There is one very important ligament to associate with this articulation point, which is an iliofemoral ligament, the iliofemoral ligament, which basically attaches along, in this case, the kind of posterior and inferior portion of the ilium and the ischium as well. And then it wraps around the head and, more importantly, the neck of the femur, attaching just medial to the greater trochanter of the femur. And this iliofemoral ligament is very unique in a bipedal model. It's very strong in a bipedal model as well. And that has a lot to do with the angle of the diaphysis or the shaft of the femur. So keep that one in mind because that's something that the attachment points of which are things that we look at in anthropological circles to estimate the strength of that ligament and to consider, the role that bipedal locomotion played in the life and the ecology of the animal that we're looking at. Basically, the strength of this ligament is associated with holding that femur up into the ball and socket joint. Now, there are two kind of secondary ligament attachments in this same area, one inferior and then one anterior and inferior to the iliofemoral ligament, which again is kind of primary in terms of the importance of understanding how these two bones are articulating with one another. But you have the ischiofemoral ligament, again inferior, and more with the ischium and the proximal portion of the femur. And then you have the pubofemoral ligament. That would be the more anterior expression. That one is also very important. But again, they are lying, in terms of importance, secondary to that iliofemoral ligament attachment, which is so very important when you're trying to assess the angle of the neck and head of the femur as it relates to the acetabulum, where it's articulating with the hip bone, and the role that that angle and ultimately the strength of that area, the role that that played in this case, posture and in locomotion. So keep that in mind because, again, you can't really separate out the structure of these bones and how they are articulating with one another and their functionality. And that's why I'm always trying to bring that kind of biometric and biomechanical piece into our discussion. I have this image as well, and I really feel that this will help you kind of connect all the dots with regard to these many landmarks that we associate with the pelvic girdle, the idea of an inlet and an outlet as they relate to a greater or lesser expression to the girdle, where all of those are, where this promontory is, and then the overall shape of the three sections of each of the coxal bones, and how in the acetabulum and in what we'll be looking at next, which is the proximal portion of the thigh, the lower extremity, in this case the femur, how that all in a sense connects and gives us a sense of how they relate to one another in terms of angles and potentially movement. So pause the lecture here, make sure to reference what I'm describing and some of these larger themes, anthropological themes, to the reference material for the lecture itself. Kind of look at the blown up image there and just start to connect some of these different parts, their locations, and then the kind of biomechanical structural nature of these two bony regions, one with the axis of the body, one moving out into the lower appendages or the appendicular skeleton of the body as well. Now on to the femur. The femur or the thigh bone is the longest and heaviest bone of the body. Its proximal end articulates with the coxal bones. Its distal end articulates with the tibia. And in terms of looking at the joint and some of the associated muscles, again, there are a lot of them, ligaments and muscles, not to mention tendon attachments as well. We will focus more on the hip joint for this lecture, and then when we move into the kind of the lower portion of the lower extremities with the tibia and the fibula, we will then move back into the knee joint and look at that a little more closely as well, because the architecture of these two locations is very important to understanding something about the locomotion in the human model. The body of the femur angles medially as it approaches the femur of the opposite thigh. So basically, as you move down from the hip to the knee, the shaft or the diaphysis of the femur is going to angle inward. And this is giving us that closed kneed stance and this kind of locking design to our knees that's important for human stature, human posture, and of course, it is an integral part of the design of our locomotor pattern. The proximal end of the femur consists of a rounded head that articulates with the acetabulum of the coxal bone. The neck of the femur is a constricted region distal to the head. A fairly common fracture in people of an older age, let's say beyond 70 years of age, occurs at the neck of the femur. This is an area where we see a degeneration of bone material. We see a lot of minerals and the actual, bone material itself being drawn out of this and metabolized by the body as part of the kind of the aging process. The neck can become very, very weak and it can fail to support the body. So the head and the neck and this particular condition uh, definitely, and this common fracture is speaking to that. The head and the neck are holding a pretty significant amount of weight with regard to the body itself. And then, as I mentioned before, some of the ligaments that surround the head and the neck are also taking a lot of that weight. And the desire that the proximal end of the femur has to kind of move more laterally because of that medial angle to the diaphysis. So it always wants to kind of push out laterally. And the muscles, the ligament attachments, and then even the mechanics of the head and neck themselves are also a part of, kind of holding all of that architecture together. You have the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter. There are projections that serve as points of attachment for some of the thigh and buttocks muscles. And then between them, you have the intertrochanteric line and crest. So these are all important locations, again, for both muscle tendon attachments and then also ligament attachments associated with this area. So the greater and lesser trochanter, and then these intertrochanteric lines and crests that all make up the overall architecture. And that's what we use in archaeology and bioarchaeology to identify sections of this bone. Now, the size of these locations are also important when you're talking about estimates of the overall size of an individual that you're looking at. And it will tell you something about the robusticity of the associated joint itself. The diaphysis, or the shaft of the femur, contains a rough vertical line or ridge on its posterior surface, this linea aspera. This ridge serves for the attachment of several of the thigh muscles. The size and shape of the linea aspera is something that we use again for estimating or assessing the robusticity of an individual or the overall size. The distal end of the femur is expanded and includes a medial condyle and a lateral condyle. These articulate with the tibia. Superior to the condyles are the medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle. A depression or a depressed area exists between the condyles on the superior surface. This is called the intercondylar fossa. The intercondylar fossa. And then we have the patellar surface, which is located between the condyles on that anterior surface. So we have a medial condyle, a lateral condyle. We have a medial epicondyle and a lateral epicondyle. Again, important attachments for muscle structure. And then we have this intercondylar fossa and then the patellar surface anterior to the bone in this distal location or at this end of the bone. Pathological changes in the angle of the neck of the femur result in an abnormal posture associated with lower limbs. That is some of which is congenital in nature, and we see this in growth and development associated with the bone. Sometimes there's a decreased angle associated with this condition. A knock-kneed condition is something that in medical circles is a symptom of that misalignment and this abnormal development. And then an abnormally large angle can create more of a kind of a bowed leg condition. Both of these pathological changes to the angle of the neck of the femur do put abnormal strain on the knee joints. So these are also things to consider when you're looking at the kind of overall structure of the thigh itself and how important the development of regions associated not only with the femur itself, but of course the coxal bone and its overall orientation as it develops. These are very important qualities relating to the biomechanics of the surrounding joints and joint surfaces, and then the overall quality of life that is associated with posture and locomotion. As I said before, there are a lot of muscle attachments associated with the gross movements of both the thigh and the abdomen, but we'll highlight just a few of them for their anthropological importance. With regard to the abdominal wall, the again, movement of the abdomen, the compression and contraction of certain muscles is important for not only respiration but also movement of that vertebral column. The rectus abdominis muscle, which originates with the pubic crest and the pubic symphysis, this inserts in the rib cage or the thorax, and it compresses the abdomen. This helps with urination, it helps with expiration in terms of respiration. And then, of course, it is an important muscle with regard to childbirth in females. We also have the external and internal oblique muscles. The origin of these muscles is a little bit different. The external oblique muscles will originate in the thorax, this eighth rib, but it inserts with the iliac crest. The internal oblique muscles are going to actually originate with the iliac crest, and then they will insert with the cartilage of the thorax, at least the last four muscles, or four ribs rather, of the thorax. And both the external oblique and internal obliques, in terms of their actions, has to do with either a contraction, compressing the abdomen, that would be the external oblique. If you want to move or bend the abdomen to one side or the other, or move that vertebral column, the middle and lower portion of the vertebral column kind of to one side or the other, that's the external oblique. And then the internal obliques, which again originate with the iliac crest of the pelvic girdle, these compress the abdomen and again assist in that lateral compression on one side or the other. So the external and internal obliques are going to associate with either an insertion or an origin, depending on the muscle, as it relates to the pelvic girdle. And then the rectus abdominis will also originate, in this case, with the pubic crest and the symphysis. And that, again, is associated with physiological processes, things like respiration, but then also some of the mechanical aspects associated with childbirth and urination. Then when we look at the architecture of the lower or lesser pelvis and that inferior expression of it, we start to see a number of muscle attachments associated with the pelvic floor that are important for, again, associated with gastrointestinal kinds of contractions and movements, and then of course childbirth and things like that. But we'll just, in a sense, broadly think about the pelvis, the pelvic girdle, and then muscles of the pelvic floor. So muscles of the abdomen and its movement, compression, contraction, lateral movement, in this case kind of bending over and some of the movements associated with that, an association with respiration and childbirth. The pelvic floor, another broad area of muscles and their attachments and their actions, in this case associated with gastrointestinal processes and of course childbirth as well. And then the many muscles of the thigh, but we'll just cherry pick some of the more important ones that are associated with evolutionary biology and the biomechanics of the region. Feel free to pause this lecture at any point to compare these images with some of these additional resources that are associated with the course and the lecture. And then as you're reviewing your notes and looking at specific muscles and how they relate to the architecture, not only of the girdle itself, but then the thigh and some of the processes and movements around those two physical locations, you can really kind of sit down and look at these more closely. When you're talking then about the muscles that move the thigh, it's important to touch upon the work of the gluteus muscles. There are three expressions to the gluteus muscles. We have the maximus, this muscle that associates with the iliac crest along with the sacrum and the coccyx. This extends and rotates the thigh laterally. And then the gluteus medius and minimus. Now the medius and minimus are both originating with the ilium. So the iliac crest, gluteus maximus, the medius and minimus, the ilium. And these two will insert with the greater trochanter of the femur itself. So the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus both originate with the ilium of the pelvic girdle, whereas the gluteus maximus is going to originate with that iliac crest. Then the greater trochanter of the femur is the insertion point for the medius and the minimus. Now, the medius and the minimus abduct and rotate the thigh, whereas the gluteus maximus extended and rotated the thigh laterally. The medius and minimus abduct and rotate the thigh medially. So again, the movement of that thigh is important to this muscle group, and the shape and the attachment points associated with, in this case, the pelvic girdle become important to these muscles as well, just because of their origins. Now what I'll do here is I will give you two diagrams for you to look at the overall expression of the girdle, the crests and the ridges, and the specific locations within that developmental field, the three major locations within that developmental field, and then the thigh itself and where these particular muscles are originating and inserting. Then think about those actions as well and how important those become with regard to the movement of the lower extremities. We have the tensor fascia lata, a important muscle that flexes and abducts the thigh. It will originate with the iliac crest. So the tensor fascia lata and the iliac crest are closely associated, and then it will insert with the tibia. But the iliac crest is what I'd like you to associate with that muscle and how it flexes and abducts the thigh. We have the psoas muscle, which we looked at before. There is a psoas major and minor. The psoas major will originate with the lumbar vertebrae, but then it will insert with the lesser trochanter of the femur. So the psoas muscle, it will insert with the lesser trochanter of the femur. It connects the femur with the transverse processes of the lumbar vertebrae, which again are its point of origin there. And then it flexes and rotates the thigh. And then we have the rectus femoris. This particular muscle will associate with the architecture of the knee and of course the pectoral girdle, and then it will in terms of action will associate with the thigh itself. The rectus femoris will originate with the iliac spine of the pelvic girdle, and then it will insert in the knee, associated in this case with the patella. This particular muscle is important for flexing the hip and extending the knee. So the rectus femoris becomes an important muscle when we're taking a look at the architecture of the pelvic girdle, at least the kind of lateral and inferior portions of that, and then how that pelvic girdle also will interact with the lower extremity, specifically the knee. And then finally we have the gracilis muscle. This muscle is associated with the medial portion of the thigh. It will originate with the pubic symphysis, and then it will insert again at the tibia. So another connection between the pelvic girdle and the tibia of the lower extremities. What does this do? Well, the gracilis muscle will adduct the thigh. It brings it close to the midline of the body. Take a moment and review these muscles. Think about their overall movement and attachment point. Think about how the tendons and the muscles of each of these major groups connects what we've been taking a look at in terms of the lower extremities. Think about the ligament attachments and the architecture of the joints themselves, and then frame all of that in relation to the overall structure of the skeletal anatomy, both axial and appendicular, and then the biomechanical movements that we associate with not only our posture, but our system of locomotion.